tonight is quite an auspicious occasion for VIAD, the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center, and for UJ, I think, to welcome Prof. T.J. Demos as a distinguished visiting professor into our community. To tell you very briefly about Prof. Demos, he's professor in art history at the Department of History of Art and Visual Culture, University of California, Santa Cruz, and the founding director of its Center for Creative Ecologies. He is a cultural critic, art historian, curator, and prolific writer, with his work spanning across intersecting fields of art history, contemporary art, visual culture, and ecology, as well as global and environmental politics. And with that background, I'm just going to sketch quite very briefly, in fact, how Prof. Demos's work aligns with that of VIAD's. So VIAD is the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center, which is located in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture here at UJ. And it is quite a long-established center. In fact, it was founded 18 years ago, pretty much with the founding of the University of Johannesburg itself, which turns 20 this year. So it was part of an initiative, actually, where 6 new research centers were established, together with the establishment of the University of Johannesburg. And yeah, it's great to say that we are still thriving, we're still busy and working, and able to work with such esteemed academics and scholars and practitioners such as T.J. Demos. About VIAD, we are an intersectional platform dedicated to critical exchange and research around world building through radical creative practice and critical theory. We have been focusing on the production of insights and perspectives that come from and pertain to African and African diasporic contexts, and hope to provide a critical space wherein visual representation becomes a means to prompt social, economic, environmental, and political transformation through decolonial practice. We see ourselves as an ever-emergent, generative space, a space of intellect and creativity, in which play and imagination, experimentation and inventiveness are harnessed to produce radically new forms of making and thinking. VIAD's current focus areas and programs of critical engagements put forward decolonial ways of thinking about what it means to be human, promotes forms of world building through creative practice and critical theory, and explores the potential for multiple forms of humanities and trans-species alliances based on diversity, complexity, and hybridization. Creative practice and critical theory are used to affect social, political, and environmental change in order to address the urgent concerns around these factors. Prof. Demos's work has strong correlations with VIAD's core thematics in that he too considers how innovative and experimental strategies may be fostered through the artistic ability to underscore and problematize dominant conventions in economic, social, political, and ecological contexts. I'm going to now give you over to the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture Dean, Prof. Frederico Freschke, who will tell you more about Prof. Demos.
Thanks, Leora. Sunny Banani. Dumilang. Good evening. It's a great pleasure and privilege indeed to welcome you all here this evening on behalf of the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at the great University of Johannesburg, as our Vice-Chancellor likes to call it. And indeed it is a great university, and as Leora notes, we celebrate 20 years this year. So it's really wonderful to have the privilege of hosting such distinguished guests. So this is really an inaugural lecture for Professor Demos, who joins us here as a distinguished visiting professor. Also in the room with us this evening is our other distinguished visiting professor, Professor Anthony Bogues. Welcome, sir. Lovely to have you here. who gave a beautiful lecture here last year in this very room, as I'm sure many of you remember. The title of Distinguished Visiting Professor is the highest honorary title that our university can confer. And it's reserved for those who, through proven knowledge and demonstrated insight, have achieved international acclaim as leaders in their field, and who, by their association with the University of Johannesburg, bring prestige to our pursuit of scholarship and global excellence. So as Leora briefly introduced, Professor Demos is a professor and chair of art history at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he's also the founding director of the Center for Creative Ecologies. Over the course of a distinguished career, he has established himself as one of the most influential voices in the study of contemporary art, visual culture, and ecology. His award-winning books, among them Radical Futurisms, 2023, Beyond the World's End, 2020, Decolonizing Nature, 2016, and Against the Anthropocene, 2017, have been widely read and translated, shaping international debates at the intersection of aesthetics, decolonial thought, and environmental politics. Professor Demos is not entirely a stranger to UJ, having been appointed previously as a Distinguished Research Associate here in VIAD. And this relationship really makes his appointment as a Distinguished Visiting Professor all the more meaningful for us. What makes his career particularly inspiring is its breadth. Beyond his prolific scholarship, Professor Demos has curated exhibitions from Madrid to Nottingham, collaborated with artists and researchers across continents, and held prestigious fellowships from institutions such as the Getty Research Institute and the Mellon Foundation. His work exemplifies how scholarship can move beyond the academy to engage with urgent global debates about environment, justice, and the future. And this evening, Professor Demos invites us into precisely such a conversation, asking how contemporary art reimagines justice in an age of collapsing institutions and ecological crisis. It is, as I'm sure you'll agree, a timely and important provocation, and we are really privileged to be able to host it here at the University of Johannesburg. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor T.J. Demos.
Thanks very much for that very generous introduction, and welcome everyone. I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks to Professor Leora Farber for making this possible and inviting me to be involved in the University of Johannesburg and the VIAD Center. It's a real honor to collaborate with the center. I'd also like to thank the team of VIAD, including Nandumiso Msimanga and Brenton March, as well as Dean Federico Freschke. Thank you all so much for coming, and welcome to our online audience as well. I'm told that I'm supposed to use this mic for the online audience so that everyone can hear me. So that's why I'm holding this, even though it might not seem to benefit you at all. So I'm going to give a presentation. It will be about maybe 50 minutes or so, and then we should have a little time for discussion. So what I'm going to share with you is an early version of a new book project that I'm working on, which investigates the problem of justice. This is a term that I've drawn on and had recourse to throughout many of my former research projects, but never really attempted to theorize it and problematize it. Like, what is justice? What are its limits? What are its problems? How might we rethink justice? How are people out in the world, including artists and theorists, thinking about justice today? It's by no means a simple term, and as we're living through this present where we're witnessing seemingly internationally the collapse of any meaningful realization of justice, along with the institutions that historically have been dedicated to justice. I think this demands some thinking and rethinking about what justice can possibly mean today. I have a few case studies and some discussion of the problem of justice, and then we can discuss a bit more. All right. There is no justice, writes the poet Claudia Rankine, as if from the chasm between the ideal of justice as sublime object and the lived reality of systemic injustice, there is just us. Her poetry expresses deep pessimism about the availability of social equality given structural racism in the US, and yet points with a glimmer of promise to the necessary collective agency that would nonetheless hold values to account, making their abstractions meaningful. Such a view, perhaps something like a renewed articulation of undefeated despair, characterizes much art these days, especially those practices that retain an investment in justice. Despite all, its existence serving as a compass of redress, of reparation, of some kind of hopeful futurity, notwithstanding the elusiveness of justice given the catastrophe of its conventional invocations. I have in mind 3 examples. First, Jackie Sumel's Solitary Garden, situated on the campus of UC Santa Cruz, where I teach, which reconstructs a prison cell surrounded by a garden of edible and medicinal plants, designed in collaboration with Timothy Young, who has spent over 2 decades in solitary confinement while proclaiming his innocence, and which invites viewers to become abolitionists in imagining a landscape without prisons. Second, Forensic Architecture's Environmental Racism in Death Alley, an investigative project that uses spatial analysis technologies to trace how southeastern Louisiana in the US has evolved from slave-based plantations to a dense petrochemical corridor, revealing the continuity of racial slavery in its transformation into environmental racism, and yet works for redress through the protection of cultural heritage and conservation. And third, Vivian Sansour's Heirloom Seed Library and Traveling Kitchen, which preserve and share Palestinian botanical traditions as a form of resistance against cultural erasure under Israeli settler colonialism, now in the shadow of Israel's genocide and ecocide in Gaza. Each of these projects makes claims on justice. Forensic Architecture writes about their project by saying, the Black descendant community has long voiced demands for accountability from the petrochemical corporations that occupy their lands. Today, this demand is building into a broader vision of justice, they write. What is this justice? How does it enter into aesthetic form? How is it conceptualized and realized? How does it do so, especially today, in an era marked by proliferating legalized injustice, given the everyday brutalities of late racial fascism, the international normalization of ecocide-genocide, in the face of which the global institutions of the modern liberal democratic order, for instance, United Nations protections, the International Court of Justice, and along with them, the universality of human rights, appear to be collapsing. Justice itself is weeping, suspended between redress and endless deferral. Justice names oppression, but will it ever materialize within the state's colonial futurity? Justice is in many ways a tear, and at once an opening, a wound, an expression of grief, if also a promise. It persists, however, in aesthetic form, collaborative in procedure, as both lament and proposition, a gap and a horizon, including arguably an agreed upon condition for Rankin's just us, to even have collective possibility. If so, then how does art compose a collective? How is justice proceduralized in aesthetic play? Where and how does justice's conceptualization of demands, of grievances, and its proceduralization or juridification as process meet in aesthetic form? These are among the questions I want to ask in what follows. Sumel's Solitary Garden confronts the crisis of mass incarceration in the US while offering a profound meditation on the layered meanings of climate justice. Rather than simplifying this concept, well defined in social movement, cultures, and progressive policy circles, the project materializes climate justice as a generative force, not a flaw to be corrected, but a flourish to be cultivated. Climate expands across registers: environmental, social, emotional, carceral, as visitors are invited to sit with, visualize, and feel a space Jung likens to, that is his prison cell, to a coffin. An architecture of racial violence, prisons summon the climates of anti-blackness. Christina Sharp cites in her work In the Wake. Atmospheric effects of racial violence, shaped in the wake and afterlife of slavery, where racial capitalism continues to structure the lived experience, or rather an environment as cell for those experiencing a living death. This carceral climate is not metaphorical. It designates the ambient atmosphere of solitary confinement, a site that George Jackson, the Black Power revolutionary who died trying to escape San Quentin in 1971, once described as the land of tears, where the force of law, inscribed in steel and concrete, meets the vulnerability of flesh. As a mechanism of psychological and spiritual annihilation, prison erases identity and humanity, committing a mode of social death, in the words of Lisa Gunther. Echoing Sharp, Olufemi Taiwo warns of climate apartheid as the coming police violence crisis, glimpsed in present climate saturated with surveillance, policing, and racialized inequality. Again, the prison cell is the epitome of such ambient racial terror in continuum with anti-black slavery and Jim Crow in the US, as Taiwo notes. Adding brutality to Donna Haraway's concept of nature culture, deliberately unhyphenated to resist binary division between the ecological and the social. Carceral logics go further in weaponizing environment against nature. As Jackson wrote, men are brutalized by their environment, not the reverse. In Solitary Garden, climate designates both environmental punishment and racial reckoning, a space where the dominant notion of justice is unmasked as profoundly unjust. What could be more violently contradictory than calling the practice of caging human beings in a state of brutal isolation justice, even if it is the law? Crucially, in this sense, justice must be distinguished from law. As Derrida noted in the early 1990s, the relationship between the two is ever only asymptotic. They never completely connect, law and justice, unleashing conflicts that help define justice as form in ways that problematize its content. First, once codified into law, justice becomes mechanistic and inflexible, a calculation rather than a principle. Second, when instituted, justice remains haunted by the ghost of the undecidable, determined by capricious subjective reasoning detached from democratic accountability. And third, justice always gestures toward a future that is never fully present, its fulfillment always deferred, its urgency unmet. These paradoxes help explain how justice is not only obstinate or arbitrary, but commonly weaponized, rendered subordinate to corrupt legality or capricious sovereignty, where justice stands betrayed by autocratic decision and or unjust conceptualization. Institutions like the US Department of Justice routinely, increasingly enforce injustice, legitimizing legalized late fascism. These are the words of Alberto Toscano, through the convergence of ethno-nationalist authoritarianism and corporate power. Of course, the US's liberal democracy always contained this glaring contradiction, obvious in a state founded on freedom and yet forged through anti-indigenous genocide and racial slavery. But recent atrocities, from the genocide in Gaza to anti-black police violence, from the abuse of migrants to state attacks on universities, all justified in the name of justice, intensify the contradiction. The term justice is commonly distorted to protect elites like Trump, shielding them from accountability for all manner of corruption, sexual violence, pathological deceit. Giving expression to justice's flourishing uncontainability, Fred Moten, and I realize this might be a little hard to see if you're in the back, but I'm going to quote from this. Fred Moten builds on Derrida while drawing on the legal scholar Robert Cover's idea of what he calls the juris generative. So that's a term that Fred Moten uses, juris referring to justice or law, and generative, what is productive or creative. So the creativity of justice, the juris generative. In recognizing how justice thrives from below, its meanings unleashed in uncontrollable flourishings in the poetic, musical, and cultural life worlds of resistance, in undercommon acts, confounding inside and outside, subverting conventional forms and perspectives. What if it is, in fact, so full of laws that the imagination of necessity is constantly, fugitively, in excess of itself? Fred Moten asks. And he's thinking about this term juris generative in relationship to jazz, for instance, in the States, as a sonic form of the production, the creativity of justice. In this framing, emerging from Moten's Black study, law is never simply instituted, but always insurgent, manifest paralegally, criminally, fugitively, as a kind of ongoing anti-systemic break or breaking, including as a political and aesthetic force that, in Moten's words, takes form in and as a contemporaneity of different times and the inhabitation of multiple possible worlds. Okay, Solitary Garden manifests, I want to suggest, this anti-systemic break or breaking, recasting justice as antidote to overlapping systems of harm, not a name for their legitimation. Perhaps it's the piece's dreamy vision of an abandoned, broken down prison cell that Solitary Garden imagines, as if in a state of carceral ruination or a gravesite, overcome by a vengeful nature in an act of revolutionary fabulation. Or maybe we're looking back on a distant past of horror from the vantage of some abolitionist world to come. In either case, Sumel's garden offers a counter-imaginary to a perverted carceral justice, ultimately a landscape without prisons, in the artist's words, or what I call abolition ecology. Abolition ecology exists, I propose, at the nexus of W.B. Du Bois's abolition democracy, the abolition that must necessarily accompany the ending of racial slavery and its aftermath in order to reach or realize the conditions of democracy. So that's Du Bois's abolition democracy. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore's abolition geography, as she argues, freedom as a place. Abolition geography is freedom as space. And she's thinking about the ending of the prison industrial complex in the States, as well as Haraway's multi-species justice, a kind of justice beyond anthropocentrism. This abolitionist negation, the negation of the prison as perversion of justice, however, appears fully imminent in the creeping carceral landscape that threatens its criticality, a view perceptible when one inverts the solitary garden's carceral gaze, which I'm trying to indicate in this slide, looking so that we're looking outwards from within the cell rather than inwards from outside on campus into the cell, so that we see a cell transformed, we don't see a cell transformed into a garden so much as a campus become a kind of prison, a place of institutionalized control and militarized policing. So I'm trying to argue for a complexity for this piece and how we might read it. If so, this shift of perspective registers but also condemns the university's post-2024 repression and criminalization of nonviolent student dissent, including quelling interrelated labor struggles and the uprising against Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. So this is on the left that you're seeing a scene from the police clampdown on student protests in 2024. Solitary Garden in this light, without intention, but with its critical capacity, registers and condemns all such landscapes become carceral, where environmental design facilitates surveillance, border militarization, alligator Alcatraz, and the like. From desert heat as a kind of thermal biopolitics, deployed as a deathly deterrent to migration, to the clearing of vegetation for line-of-sight policing, where nature itself becomes a technology of control. And I realize that this idea of the weaponization of nature is not, it's hardly new. It's something that has a long history, including in South Africa. There's this one photographic piece by David Goldblatt that shows this almond hedge planted in 1660. So in the 17th century, in Kirstenbosch in Cape Town, in order to keep indigenous Khoi people away from the colonial settlement and its property. So going back at least to the 17th century, if not earlier, nature has been operationalized in the name of security, according to colonial bordering or colonial fencing of property and people. More precisely, the work Solitary Garden indicts the Department of Justice that would practice solitary confinement, a practice internationally condemned as torture, while also opening a space for the poetic and speculative, where justice, given this corrupted overarching system, perhaps can only appear in fugitive excess of itself, to recall Fred Moten, taking flight or growing into the contemporaneity of different times, in the emergence of multiple possible worlds and personalities. In this regard, the work possesses a ghostly poetics. Its sculptural grammar, its carceral architecture, suggests so many specific objects: a bed, sink, toilet, table, stool, which you can see in this image here, rendered in blocks akin to a minimalism that once claimed non-relational internal compositions as a means of escape from the outmoded anthropocentrism of European sculptural genealogies. Minimalist forms appeared strangely animated by a human apparition, so there always seems to be a human presence within this kind of sculptural production. If so, the figure conjured here in Solitary Garden is neither the universal human of Enlightenment reason, nor humanity's universalist phenomenology. How could it be, given the refusal of the European racialized taxonomies of the human to recognize blackness? Rather, its spectral figuration, the absent presence of Tim Young, suggests a kind of post-anthropocentric being, a relational assemblage that both emerges from and resists Enlightenment categories and human exceptionalist ontologies. This spectral prisoner, in other words, dissolves into or reappears within a multi-species assemblage, enacting Ruth Wilson Gilmore's vision of abolition as freedom as a place, but with emancipation from human exceptionalism mixed in. As Haraway wonders, what happens when human exceptionalism and bounded individualism become unthinkable in the best practices? Solitary Garden offers a speculative and political response, a post-anthropocentric, anti-racist ecology of care and co-becoming. What I mean is that Solitary Garden, in this piece, justice appears enacted as a kind of sensory emancipation. Tim Young, the imprisoned collaborator, is conceptually freed from the isolation of steel and concrete. He becomes part of a living ecology. His presence dispersed into flowers, insects, and plants, his body in fugitive excess of itself, liberated from carceral gray into a vibrant chromatic multi-species insurgency. The garden, tended by abolitionist volunteers, becomes a living site of resistance and solidarity. Timothy Young writes that while he couldn't leave his cell physically for over 2 decades, in solitary confinement, he could transport himself mentally, thanks to Sumel's project. And in his words, he writes, "I pictured myself at the Solitary Garden on the UC Santa Cruz campus. I sat on the bench and I overlooked the garden in solitude. I meditated. I walked around the structure, taking in the panoramic splendor of all the flowers and plants. And then I did what I've been dreaming of for so long. I squatted down and felt the earth. I picked up the soil and let it sift through my hands. It has been 21 years. Justice, then, is not merely a deferred ideal, sealed in some distant future. It ruptures the present with radical possibility, embodied, fugitive, flourishing, as a freedom dream of climate justice summoned from within the place of tears. A second example of contemporary art's engagement with justice and its many internal rifts is this project, Environmental Racism in Death Alley, a 2021 forensic architecture project with lead researchers being Imani Jacqueline Brown and Samanea Moafi. Dated 1718 to ongoing, as you see on the slide from the website. Ostensibly to underscore the historical continuity of the centuries-long violence it investigates, including periods of indigenous dispossession, genocide, and anti-black slavery. The work developed in partnership with Rise St. James, a faith-based grassroots organization fighting for environmental justice as it works to defeat the proliferation of petrochemical industries in St. James Parish, Louisiana. This open access, and here you see the website of Rise St. James on the left and an overview of what this petrochemical corridor in Louisiana looks like along the Mississippi River. So this open access project, so it's a website in part. Here's an image from the website. It maps a continuum from plantation-era slavery to environmental racism in this area called Cancer Alley, along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, the 2 main cities along the river. Through historical cartography, remote sensing, and 3D modeling, different kind of technological approaches to imaging, the investigation overlays archival plantation maps, like this one, with contemporary land surveys to identify sites of cultural and ecological significance. Along these are uncultivated patches of land, often marked by magnolia and willow trees, that served as so-called sacred groves, where enslaved people once buried their dead. So this is an example of what you're looking at here of such a sacred grove. These topological anomalies, seldom visible to the state, are now key to claiming legal protections and resisting further industrial encroachment. Rooted in an intersectional vision of justice where environment, race, and class are inseparable, protecting cultural heritage functions as environmental defense, while preserving the environment becomes an act of honoring Black history, especially for local communities descended from those enslaved on plantation lands. So in other words, we're dealing with an area here of communities that come out of a past of enslavement, that are still living in the same area. Their descendants are living in the same area, now subjected to petrochemical environmental racism. Okay. So locating a cemetery on these lands, on these former plantation lands, both is capable of shutting down petrochemical expansion and preserving African American heritage. A central flashpoint in this ongoing struggle is Formosa Plastics' proposed $9.4 billion Sunshine Project, which you see a plan for here. It's a sprawling plastics production facility slated for construction in St. James Parish, one among many. While the Taiwanese multinational's hired archaeological firm initially reported no sites worthy of historical preservation, Rise St. James, aware of the land's burial history, commissioned Coastal Environments to conduct a second review, and with legal support from the Center for Constitutional Rights, they identified 4 likely slave cemeteries on the site, 3 of which lay directly within Formosa's planned footprint. In response, Rise St. James enlisted forensic architecture to develop a predictive model for locating unmarked Black cemeteries and to conduct what they call a fluid dynamics analysis, projecting airborne pollutant dispersal from the planned plant, as you can see in this video still. Right? It depends on which way the wind is blowing. The chemical toxins will flow in any number of directions and pollute surrounding communities. The results were damning, not surprisingly. The neighboring majority Black town of Welcome would be exposed to levels of ethylene oxide far exceeding the EPA's acceptable cancer risk threshold. This is just one small example of the vast geography of toxicity in this area. Nevertheless, in 2025, the St. James Parish Council, the city government, reaffirmed its support for the project, reflecting the broader deregulatory agenda under Trump's second administration, which includes the defunding of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the shuttering of regional environmental justice offices, and the deactivation of EJ Screen, a key tool for tracking environmental harm in marginalized communities. As forensic architecture concludes, through the lens of the petrochemical plantation burial ground, Death Alley, as they call it, Death Alley is revealed as a 300-year continuum of environmental racism. The project insists that justice must consider the whole ecology as a complex array of times and geographies, from the fields where the enslaved lived and labored, to the forests where mourning and resistance took place, to the courtrooms where present-day Black communities fight to protect their health, land, and future from the entwined economic and legal frameworks of global capital. FA's project intervenes then on 2 fronts. First, it represents a kind of juridification from below, a grassroots activation of legal frameworks and open access technologies, including this freely available interactive mapping portal online, in service of community protection and historical recognition, rather than advancing state or corporate interests. But more radically, FA critiques the limits of existing legal regimes and calls for an expanded redefinition and thus a politicization of justice, one that comprehensively integrates cultural memory, ecological integrity, and reparative demands, articulated through a collaborative, accessible, procedural form. Death Alley refuses the narrow metrics, in other words, of legal admissibility and conceptual scope, and instead offers a speculative jurisprudence rooted in black life, loss, and futurity, premised on reparations for centuries of racial violence, environmental restoration, community-sustaining jobs, a moratorium on industrial development, and self-determination over land stewardship, as is articulated in their project. So it's an incredibly comprehensive and ambitious demand for justice that's nowhere recognized in current legal codes or within courts. It goes way beyond that. So this vision resonates with the concept of justice as a world-building project. In his book, Reconsidering Reparations, Olufemi Taiwo argues that, in his words, if slavery and colonialism built the world in its current basic scheme of social injustice, the proper task of social justice is no smaller. It is quite literally to remake the world. While Derrida and Moten emphasize justice's procedural and fugitive dimensions, its refusal of fixed universal content, Taiwo provides a vital counterbalance against the backdrop of what he calls global racial empire. He insists that justice must also have substance, equity in fairly distributed capacities, redressing histories of violence and injustice, even while its details must be regionally defined in democratic process. Forensic Architecture's project enacts this logic. Justice here is not a fixed endpoint or distant ideal, but an evolving materialist practice, one that builds alternative futures through situated community grievance, concrete interventions, historical reckoning, and ecological care. Ultimately, environmental racism in Death Alley models then a capacious and insurgent climate justice, one that links history to present, cultural heritage to environmental defense, and community struggle to world-making futurity. It insists that true justice, even if it's impossible to ultimately contain, must address the full complexity of racial, environmental, and historical harm. And in doing so, it reclaims justice not only as a site of mourning, but as a form of struggle, even militancy, a procedural activism against the localized violence of global racial empire. Okay, this is my third example now. More speculative than forensic architecture, and closer in spirit to Jackie Sumel's abolition ecology, is Vivian Sansour's heirloom seed library and traveling kitchen. These are key parts of a Palestinian eco-aesthetic practice where justice's form and concept are grounded in anti-colonial botany and a community-building ethos that transcends species boundaries. Headquartered in the West Bank village of Batir, which you see here, just southwest of Jerusalem, Sansour's seed library conserves heritage seeds unique to Palestinian horticulture. These seeds are redistributed to local farmers and shared through a global network of seed advocates and agroecologists to promote biodiversity, conservation, and Palestinian liberation. For Sansour, seed diversity has, in her words, kept us alive for millennia, where the inclusive pronoun us, kept us alive, takes on a productive multivalence, embracing Palestinian people and I think humanity at large, suggesting that the survival of one is inextricable from the other, just as its converse is also the case. For instance, as Andreas Malm argues, the destruction of Palestine is the destruction of the earth. So this biodiversity is under persistent threat from monoculture-based industrial agriculture reliant on chemical inputs, and from Israeli state policies that systematically restrict Palestinian access to land, resources, and farming rights. The criminalization of Palestinian food gathering or foraging is the subject of Jumana Mana's film Foragers, a related work of political ecology and justice claims in aesthetic form. The state's threats have only intensified since October 7th, 2023, with the subsequent escalation of Israeli assaults on Gaza and settler attacks on West Bank Palestinians. For Sansour, the seed is an additional, if humble, protagonist in this drama, both a bearer of cultural memory and an active agent of resistance. Heirlooms, she explains, which have been carefully selected by our ancestors throughout thousands of years of research and imagination, form one of the last strongholds of resistance to the privatization of our life source, the seed. And she continues, these seeds carry the DNA of our survival against a violent backdrop that is seen across the hills and valleys through settlement and chemical input expansions. Complementing the seed library is Sansour's traveling kitchen, cast as an interactive social engagement art and education project. You can see different images from the traveling kitchen here. It creates spaces both locally and internationally for people to gather, prepare meals together using heirloom crops, and engage in conversation. As Sansour explains, the kitchen operates just like a seed. It serves as a catalyst to bring forth a conversation about our bioheritage and engages people to take a deeper look into their personal stories and their relationship to what they eat. In the context of forced displacement and land dispossession, what Rashid Khalidi identifies as settler colonial Israel's 100 Years' War on Palestine, Sansour's work reveals how seeds materialize enduring ties between history, community, and place. Heirloom seeds tell us stories, she says, connect us to our ancestral roots, remind us of meals our families once made at special times of the year. In this sense, seeds are not only nourishing and educational, they're discursive and subversive, smuggled across borders, hidden in luggage, stitched into refugee clothing. They defy militarized control, reclaiming presence and life when planted in soil. They function as survival media, a term that signifies their role as communicative, biopolitical, and social conduits for multi-species flourishing, opposing the violent segregation and native eliminationism of Israeli ethno-nationalist hegemony. Media are more than carriers of messages. Theorist John Durham Peters notes, they are the very infrastructures combining nature and culture that allow human life to thrive. In a more pointed formulation, Suvendrini Pereira defines survival media as acts of improvised transmutations and forced improvisations in zones of conflict. Writing about wartime Sri Lanka, another case of ethno-nationalist violence that peaked in 2009 with the Sinhala supremacist military neutralization of the Tamil minority, she describes survival media as justice media, forms of cultural politics, corporeal poetics, and their material effects that reject victimhood and perform resistance by any media necessary. Although Sansour's work is not rooted in Gaza, it's on a continuum of eco-aesthetic resistance that connects Palestinians across fragmented, occupied geographies. This includes West Bankers, subjected to the slow violence of juridico-political exclusion and social fragmentation enforced through a militarized, high-tech architecture of checkpoints, surveillance systems, separation walls, and militarized borders. And it includes Gazans experiencing the unfolding nexus of genocide and ecocide, a necropolitical algorithmic governance, where Israel's criminally engineered famine follows relentless bombing, has weaponized hunger as a tool of ethnic cleansing, cruelly pitting the biological survival instinct against the bonds of social solidarity. as Israel's leaders, such as the finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, claim that starving all Palestinians in Gaza would be just and moral. By July 31st, 2025, just a few weeks ago, Israel had destroyed over 80% of Palestinian agriculture, including the seed multiplication unit of the Palestinian Seed Bank in Hebron, operated by the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, which maintains seed banks with scores of traditional varieties adapted to arid conditions and Palestinian heritage. So this is part of a wide-scale project to destroy the conditions of Palestinian livability. Despite catastrophic conditions of Israel's systematic destruction of agricultural land and animals, nutritional infrastructure, and water sources, Gazans like Hamada Shakura, Mrs. Naja's Kitchen, and Mohammed Kamzan have heroically cultivated and shared food, though this is increasingly impossible in the advanced stages of collective starvation. And others, such as Yusuf Abu Rabea, Medu Halimi, and Mahmoud Al-Madoun of the Gaza Soup Kitchen, have been killed by the IOF throughout and since 2024. Sansur's practice, based in solidarity with cooking as resistance and survival, dreams a different world, one seed at a time, premised on equity, a multi-species flourishing, and Palestinian liberation. Here, climate justice takes on multi-species dimensions, understood as the equitable sharing of resources and the nurturing of all forms of life, human and non-human alike. Justice in this case is procedural, but not legalistic. In Sansur's hand, justice grows from the ground up toward liberated and life-sustaining futures, when small acts of care can change lives. It models a form of what I want to call embodied social justice, situated at the intersection of liberation psychology, somatic theory, and trauma studies, understanding the body as an active site where power, oppression, and resistance are registered, negotiated, and sometimes transformed. In the context of settler colonial Zionism, this takes place amidst what scholars describe as the crushing and lasting psychological damage and trauma, where the occupation is experienced psychosomatically through sensations of asphyxiation, of slow death, of psychic annihilation, manifesting in physical illness and mental distress, owing to the long-term internalization of systemic violence. A Fanonian model of decolonial psychoanalysis, as theorized by Lara Sheehy and Stephen Sheehy, makes this dynamic explicit, theorizing the colonized subject as sociogenic, where harm and pathology are produced through social systems, which is shaped not only by internal psychic structures, but also by the external forces of racialized violence and domination that become inscribed in both mind and body under Israeli state cruelty. This was written before the Gaza genocide, but it's still a remarkable book that is attempting to intervene in psychoanalytic theory. So countering such internalized violence requires a practice of disalienation, one that resists subjective fragmentation through practices of communal solidarity, bodily awareness, and political refusal. This methodology of the oppressed, according to the Shehis, wields emotional, symbolic, and somatic tools to create what they call counter technologies of liberation, including at the psychophysical level, that enable the oppressed to reclaim agency through embodied collective practices of healing and resistance, basically to decolonize the imagination and refuse to die. I see this embodied social justice at work in Censur's traveling kitchen, itself a counter-technology of liberation. It hosts events that may not and cannot directly transform geopolitical structures. Expecting it to do so would ignore the deep incommensurability between intimate artistic practices and the vast machinery of state violence and militarized injustice. Yet its significance lies elsewhere. Through non-institutional relational forms, slow, quiet, and effectively charged in mutually supportive social relations, and in the intimacy of eating and celebrating Palestinian heritage, Censur's gatherings enact powerful modelings of resistance, enabling those who participate to better inhabit the uninhabitable, even if not resolving it. These gatherings are just us, building solidarities grounded in mutual aid, collective care, and everyday survival, offering sustenance not only in food, but in the shared refusal to disappear. So the practices of Jackie Summel, forensic architecture, and Vivian Censeur present three distinct yet interconnected models of justice-seeking, each luminous in its refusal of domination and commitment to life otherwise. These artistic interventions don't offer simple representations of justice, though they do include statements, even demands for it. They rather engage with its possibilities and failures, moving within, against, and beyond the often corrupted frameworks of state and corporate institutions, perverse in calling justice the caging of human beings, or the toxic pollution of disenfranchised communities, or settler colonial acts of genocide. Summel's abolition ecology imagines justice as a garden growing against carceral and anthropocentric logics, where bodies and seeds and soil escape systems of confinement. Her work conjures a post-human fugitivity that resists not just prisons, but recruits the landscape as co-conspirator. Forensic architecture maps environmental racism as an afterlife of slavery, in the words of Saidiya Hartman, tracing pipelines back to plantation histories. Their project of juridification from below, in collaboration with socio-environmental justice organizations, also moves beyond the law toward world-building climate reparations. And in Palestine, Vivian Censur's seed-saving resists settler colonial erasure, cultivating multi-species survival, where each sprout carries memory, refusal, and the ongoing struggle to preserve life against disappearance. These practices then variously address both the where and the when of justice, refusing to let its naming and practice be determined by powerful state institutions. They intervene in diverse spaces: the courtroom, the street, the dining room table, the media, the campus, the gallery, the garden, the prison. And they operate across multiple temporalities, responding to urgent demands stemming from past injustices going back hundreds of years, while prefiguring futures that connect current laws cannot contain. Justice across these works is stretched between procedural and substantial forms. Procedurally, justice as form enacts collective process, unfinished, debated, dependent on inclusive deliberation, which determines the piece's aesthetic construction. Substantively, justice's foundations are often fragmented, but not non-existent or empty. Unlike some Afro-pessimist or indigenous decolonial thinkers who view the very concept of justice as structurally compromised, reflecting the legal infrastructure of colonial racial capitalism, what Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang describe as justice's colonial temporality, desired and delayed by the self-legitimizing narratives of the state, or what the poet Dion Brandt rejects as justice's semblance of legitimacy that conceals tyranny. So these are really strong critiques of the very concept of justice and refuse the term altogether. These practices refuse to surrender the concept at least not in the meaning-making terms of their experimental forms. They unleash juris genesis in a political aesthetic creativity that, blossoming in the work's form, generates new meanings of justice, while simultaneously undoing its capture by institutional authority. This process of justice-making then de-reifies objectification, working against the containment of justice as law or order or policy. Containment here is the work of counterinsurgency, performed not just by the police or prison guards in executing unjust law, but also increasingly within arts and educational institutions, by the guardians of meaning, of what can be said and shown, when and where, museum curators, university administrators, professors, who can and often act as cultural enforcers of ruling ideas, agents of anticipatory obedience, given permission by and within a more and more authoritarian political environment. This is a scene of police shutting down a pro-Palestinian encampment on the campus of University of California, Los Angeles, in May of 2024. The deplatforming of artists, the clearing of encampments by militarized police, even the collaboration with migration police deportation of dissenters and non-citizens are not anomalies. They reveal the deep complicity of liberal institutions in upholding the current order that some are defining as emergent forms of fascism. And this is international. This is happening internationally today. So this complicity, in conclusion, reveals more than a reactionary tendency. For a growing number of critics, it lays bare the bankruptcy of foundational liberal values, which appear crumbling in the face of racialized violence and environmental devastation. While post-Enlightenment liberal capitalism's origins within colonialism and racism were always torqued in contradiction, nowhere is it currently more visible than in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, supported across partisan lines by international and especially US political elites, and fueled by profiteering tech and weapons industries. In such a moment, I want to argue, a retreat from fascist jurisprudence to liberal neutrality or proceduralism offers no refuge, only more tears of justice and more deeper betrayals. So the response can only be mass political struggle. Art in this context is not peripheral, but deeply relevant to this world-building project, providing open space for radical reimaginings of justice, speculative, ecological, collective. Its expressions help us proliferate not only claims for climate justice, but climates of justice themselves, atmospheres of care, solidarity, collective resistance that could, if sustained, help transform the very institutions that govern life. In the capitalist ruins of the present, without any guarantees, these practices plant the seeds of a freer world. Thank you.
I'd like to start by saying thank you, TJ. I have many more, a question and a thought, then I'm going to speak right now, as I was frantically typing in the back while listening to TJ. TJ starts with the quote from Claudia Rankine, "There is no justice, there's just us." In Citizen, an American lyric, a single poem which constitutes a full book, Claudia Rankine, with whom Demos begins by quoting, writes an epigraph which states, "If they don't see happiness in the pictures, at least they'll see the black." The book-long poem provides dates, events as moments to mark shifts in the poetic tenor. I agree with Demos about Rankine's pessimism regarding actual social justice in the continuing structural violence of the US and the world. I share this cynicism as an artist who works in and thinks about South Africa specifically. Democracy as an ideal has shown itself more flawed than I may ever have imagined. But freedom still pushes its way through the long eclipse. The idea of undefeated despair I find quite useful. It reflects a state of not only being, but also a state of practice. It's a way by which I think I pursue art making in a world that seems intent on diminishing the pursuit of justice and freedom for those who are marginalized. I'd like to stay with the idea of undefeated despair as a frame for making and creating what TJ calls procedures. And then I wrote briefly here, and I have no context for this, ujustice lona akahloniphi shem. Njabula S. Ndebele writes the important essay Rediscovering the Ordinary, which says normalizing freedom is an expression to move away from simply imagining gaining freedom to being able to actually fully express the range of what freedom means. He talks about the difficult task of us having to normalize freedom. And Pumla Inaugural, who writes from this essay in Reflecting Rogue, says that the possibility of Mandela in the early 1990s, this mysterious uber-revolutionary hero, superhero of our childhood as a president of our country was so intoxicating. And the person was a person, and democracy was not freedom. And then we had to live with the trauma of freedom, as Achille Mbembe terms it. In a work that I have been making for quite some time now with an artist called Nhlanhla Mahlangu, he also speaks about this idea of emerging into the 1990s as a time of being drunk with freedom and then waking with the hangover of freedom. And then he speaks about the idea of fantasy destroyed. And I'm calling these notions into attention in relation to how we think about what justice is, what justice might be, and how justice should look. In Disinheriting Apartheid, Nhlanhla Mahlangu and I looked at the ongoing catastrophe of coming to terms with this trauma of freedom. For Mahlangu and I, in Disinheriting Apartheid, it was also about shifting the shadow of spectacle and excess as part of the normality of democratic living. The work of disinheriting freedom seemed very clear that we had to also navigate our body's resistance to the ordinary, even as we, as artists, were trying to rediscover it in our own performance practices. But we also found that we had to resituate spectacle and excess as part of our understanding of what ordinary is. And what is the ordinary when every fresh catastrophe paradoxically confronts you with your existential freedom in living a life? Every catastrophe asks you about your freedom and what you're going to do with it. So is the ordinary just us, as Claudia Rankine speaks? Is the ordinary, which is tied to the ethics of freedom and justice as a question in our perceptual sphere, then about seeing people not experience the ordinary so that we know that we need to do something to support the work of changing their situation? What Demos shows us here in some of these works are people who are pursuing a visual ordinary. Here we are, looking at examples about prison as well. Prison is not ordinary, yet we know it very well. Apartheid is not ordinary, yet it still continues in our spatial relations. Genocide should not be ordinary, but we have had to contend with these spectacles as forced into our everyday lives. And so in Undefeated Despair, I cannot yet discern the proceduralization that Demos was speaking about initially in relation to aesthetic practices of a pursuit of justice. And when Demos continued, I began to see some of the works that I recognize, some of the procedures that I know from those artists that I work with, that I think with, that I look to. And it strikes me in these that justice, as we generally think of it through juridical procedures, is part of the spectacle and excess of living a life in ever-present catastrophe. And in that, we do have to find ways to contend, not just with the ordinary, but what spectacle and excess mean in our ordinary. And so I'll go to the works of Vivian Sansou, who have playful forms of making work that fights for breath. The work itself is playful in how it approaches these procedures, these rituals, these processes. And so what in this playfulness, what in this ordinary, do we need to also discern in the ways that people are experimenting with how we reconfigure what justice can be, should be, might be? And so yes, social embodiment, full of slowness, spaces of quiet for a different kind of inhabitants, which is a term that Sarah Ahmed uses quite a lot, a different kind of inhabitants. And then I think how stunning it is to be in the presence of such artistry from those who suffer oppression, not just those who are oppressed or marginalized, but those who suffer oppression and suffer marginalization, just as we speak of those who are or have been enslaved. Because then we can discern not just undefeated despair, but also playfulness, experimentation, a will to life that exceeds resistance and that exceeds answering the questions of state politics. And so I'll come back to close by going back to Rankine, who says, if they don't see happiness in the pictures, at least they'll see black. And I ask, when we see these works, what do we perceive? And how does that cloud our capacity to think justice differently, to inhabit justice differently? Thank you, TJ, for your dedication to looking and listening and perceiving otherwise. And thank you for this lecture.